What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 9.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over every position and give you my 2019 fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 9. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues, and we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to make better fantasy football picks. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football lineups. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, fantasy football week 9. Here are my starts and sits for the quarterback position. Okay guys, I'm going to start Matthew Stafford from the Detroit Lions playing the Oakland Raiders, who have the third worst defense overall and give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford has averaged 22.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 27 fantasy points last week and 33 the game before that. And he's projected at 20.1 fantasy points here in week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, and they have the Detroit Lions trailing by 2.5. This is a great matchup. Matthew Stafford has been hot, so I'm starting Matthew Stafford here versus the Oakland Raiders. Another quarterback I'm starting this week is Jameis Winston from the Tampa Bay Bucks playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jameis Winston has averaged 21.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 26 fantasy points last week, and he rushed the ball 8 times. He's projected at 19.2 fantasy points here in week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 53 points scored in this game, and they have the Tampa Bay Bucks trailing by 7. So that's a passing game script for Jameis Winston. So I'm starting Jameis Winston here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Another quarterback I'm starting this week is Derek Carr from the Oakland Raiders playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Derek Carr has averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game on the season, but he scored 23 fantasy points last week and 18 the game before that. He's got his number 1 wide receiver, Tyrell Williams, back. He's projected at 17.9 fantasy points here in week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, and they have the Oakland Raiders favored by 2.5. This is a home game, a good matchup. Derek Carr is heating up, so I'm starting Derek Carr here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, let's take a look at the NFL Week 9 fantasy football sits at the quarterback position. I'm going to sit Mitch Trubisky from the Chicago Bears playing the Philadelphia Eagles. Mitch is only averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He only scored 9 fantasy points last week. Looks like that offense is struggling. He's got a good matchup this week versus the Philadelphia Eagles, but I don't trust Mitch Trubisky. So I'm going to sit Mitch Trubisky here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Another guy I'm going to sit this week is Kyle Allen, the quarterback from the Carolina Panthers playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 9th best defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Kyle Allen has only averaged 12.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He only scored 3 fantasy points last week. Projected at 14.5 fantasy points here in week 9. Vegas only thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, a low scoring game. So I'm going to sit Kyle Allen here versus the Tennessee Titans. And another quarterback I'm going to sit is Baker Mayfield from the Cleveland Browns playing the Denver Broncos, who have the 4th best defense overall and give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield has only scored 14 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 13 fantasy points last week. He's only projected at 14.6 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, so another low total. This is a road game for Baker, so I'm going to sit Baker Mayfield here versus the Denver Broncos.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching. If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal, all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won, and then we'll send you $100 PayPal. So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay guys, fantasy football week 9, sit 'em, start 'em for the running back position. I'm going to start Le'Veon Bell from the New York Jets playing the Miami Dolphins, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Le'Veon Bell has averaged 14.1 fantasy points per game on the season. He only scored 7 fantasy points last game and only 9 the game before that. He's on a bad team. He hasn't been great this year, but he's averaging 15.6 rush attempts per game and 6 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 91% of the snaps, and he's projected at 20 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game, and they have the New York Jets favored by 4.5. This is a great matchup. Le'Veon Bell should be able to run all over the Miami Dolphins. So I'm starting Le'Veon Bell here versus the Miami Dolphins. Another running back I'm going to start this week is Josh Jacobs from the Oakland Raiders playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Josh Jacobs has averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 17.7 rush attempts per game and about 2 pass targets per game. He's projected at 15.1 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, and they have the Oakland Raiders favored by 2.5. This is a home game. I like running backs at home, especially when they're favored in high-scoring games. So I'm starting Josh Jacobs here versus the Detroit Lions. Another running back I'm going to start here in Week 9 is Phillip Lindsay from the Denver Broncos playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Phillip Lindsay has averaged 14.7 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 13 fantasy points last week. He had 14 rush attempts and 5 pass targets. He's averaging 13.6 rush attempts per game on the season and 4 pass targets per game. He may get more work this week because of an injury to Royce Freeman. Phillip Lindsay is projected at 14 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Denver Broncos trailing by 2.5. So it should be a pretty close game, a competitive game, a home game. So I'm starting Phillip Lindsay here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, NFL Week 9, sit 'em, start 'em. Let's take a look at our fantasy football sits at the running back position. I'm going to sit Ty Johnson from the Detroit Lions playing the Oakland Raiders, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Ty Johnson has only averaged 3.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 5 fantasy points last week. He had a good opportunity in front of him, but he only got 7 rush attempts and 4 pass targets, and he didn't make the most of them. He was only on the field for 25% of the snaps, projected at 8 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, and they have the Detroit Lions trailing by 2.5. This is an away game. I don't see much promise in this guy moving forward. So I'm going to sit Ty Johnson here versus the Oakland Raiders. Another running back I'm going to sit here in Week 9 is LaShawn McCoy from the Kansas City Chiefs playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 7th best defense overall, and they give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. LaShawn McCoy has averaged 10.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 9 fantasy points last week, rushed the ball 8.6 times per game on the season. He's on the field for 38% of the snaps, and he's projected at 10.6 fantasy points here in Week 9. This is a high-scoring game total. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, and they have the Kansas City Chiefs trailing by 2.5. So the exceptional play of Damian Williams is going to eat into the rush attempts of LaShawn McCoy. He's got limited upside. He can get you single-digit fantasy points, so he's got a low floor, and I don't think he has a very high ceiling right now. Especially with Patrick Mahomes out, may not get as many goal line carries. So I'm going to sit LaShawn McCoy here versus the Minnesota Vikings. So another running back I'm going to sit, even though he's got a good matchup, I'm going to sit Frank Gore from the Buffalo Bills playing the Washington Redskins. Frank Gore is only averaging 9.9 fantasy points per game on the season, and since Devin Singletary has come back, he's taken a hit in his fantasy production. He only scored 3 fantasy points last week on 9 rush attempts. He's projected at 9.5 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 37 points scored in this game, with the Buffalo Bills favored by 9.5. So it could be a running game script for the Buffalo Bills, but I don't trust the workload of Frank Gore with Devin Singletary back. Plus, this is a low-scoring total from Vegas. So I'm going to sit Frank Gore here versus the Washington Redskins. Okay guys, if you're getting any value from this video, please hit that red subscribe button. We put out new fantasy football videos every day. So if you hit that subscribe button and ring that bell notification, you won't miss out on any of our new fantasy football videos. Tons of free stuff coming your way. It only takes a second, and it helps us push out more fantasy football content for you guys to consume each and every day. It's because of you subscribers that make this possible. So thank you for supporting this channel. Okay guys, NFL Week 9 fantasy football sits and starts at the wide receiver position. I'm going to start Marvin Jones from the Detroit Lions playing the Oakland Raiders, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Marvin Jones has averaged 15.5 fantasy points per game on the season. Most of them came from that game 2 games ago when he scored 43 fantasy points. He only scored 6 fantasy points last game, but I think he's due for a bounce back game. He's on the field for 88% of the snaps. He's projected at 13.3 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Detroit Lions trailing by 2.5. So a close game, competitive game, high-scoring game. Great matchup for Marvin Jones. I think he bounces back this week. So I'm going to start Marvin Jones here versus the Oakland Raiders. Another wide receiver I'm going to start here in Week 9 is DK Metcalf from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Tampa Bay Bucks, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DK Metcalf has averaged 10.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 16 fantasy points last week. He had 2 touchdowns. He's getting targeted 5.6 times per game. He's a big red zone target. They love to throw the ball to him in the red zone. He's on the field for 78% of the snaps, and he's projected at 12.6 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 53 points scored in this game. They have the Seattle Seahawks favored by 7. This is a home game, a huge game total, great matchup. So I'm starting DK Metcalf here versus the Tampa Bay Bucks. Another wide receiver I'm going to start here in Week 9 is Devante Parker from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Devante Parker has been pretty productive this year, averaging 10.9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 12 fantasy points last week, 17 the game before that, 12 the game before that. He's been consistent, getting an average of 6.6 targets per game. He got 8 targets last game and 10 the game before that. So tons of volume. He's on the field for 86% of the snaps, projected at 10.6 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game. And like always, they have the Miami Dolphins trailing in this game, trailing by 4.5 points. But it's always a passing game script for the Miami Dolphins, as they're always playing from behind. This is a home game for the Miami Dolphins. Great matchup. So I'm starting Devante Parker here versus the New York Jets. Okay, let's take a look at the Week 9 fantasy football sits at the wide receiver position. I'm going to sit Nicole Hardman from the Kansas City Chiefs playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 7th best defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Nicole Hardman has averaged 10.1 fantasy points per game on the season. He did score 14 fantasy points last week, but it was on 2 pass targets. He's only averaging 4 pass targets per game on the season. He's only on the field for 58% of the snaps, projected at 7.3 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game. They have the Kansas City Chiefs trailing by 3.5. If you have to start this guy, go ahead. But until Patrick Mahomes comes back, I think I can find better options, especially because he's only getting an average of 4 pass targets per game. It makes him super risky. So I'm going to sit Nicole Hardman here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Another wide receiver I'm going to sit here in Week 9 is Adam Humphries from the Tennessee Titans playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Adam Humphries is only averaging 6.7 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 5 fantasy points last week off of 6 pass targets, but he's only averaging 4.6 pass targets per game on the season, projected at 7.5 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, and they have the Tennessee Titans trailing by 3.5. So I'm going to sit Adam Humphries here versus the Carolina Panthers. Another wide receiver I'm going to sit this week is Nelson Agholor from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Chicago Bears, who have the 5th best defense overall, and they give up the 5th least fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Nelson Agholor is averaging 9.5 fantasy points per game on the season, but he hasn't been doing that well since Alshon Jeffrey came back. He only got 5 fantasy points last week, 4 fantasy points the game before that. He's getting 5.8 pass targets per game, but only 4 pass targets per game in the last 2. He's projected at 7.3 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44 points scored in this game, and they have the Philadelphia Eagles favored by 5. So I'm going to sit Nelson Agholor here versus the Chicago Bears.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, NBA, MLB, and NHL. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, NFL Week 9 fantasy football, sit 'em, start 'em for the tight end position. I'm going to start Hunter Henry from the LA Chargers playing the Green Bay Packers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Hunter Henry has averaged 16.9 fantasy points per game on the season. He's coming off of a mediocre game last game, only scored 9 fantasy points, but he's averaging 7 targets per game on the season, and he's on the field for 76% of the snaps. Projected at 13.2 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Chargers trailing by 3.5. This is a home game. I love Hunter Henry. Great matchup. So I'm going to start Hunter Henry here versus the Green Bay Packers. Another tight end I'm going to start is Cameron Brate from the Tampa Bay Bucks playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Cameron Brate is averaging 6 fantasy points per game on the season, but he got 6 pass targets last game, and it looks like they're starting to involve him more in the offense. He's projected at 6 fantasy points here in Week 9. This is a high game total. Vegas thinks there's going to be 53 points scored in this game, and they have the Tampa Bay Bucks trailing by 7. So this is a passing game script. I think Cameron Brate will get plenty of looks this game. He's got a great matchup. So if you're looking for a tight end, I'm going to start Cameron Brate here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Okay, let's take a look at who I'm going to sit here in Week 9 at the tight end position. I'm going to sit Ricky Seals-Jones from the Cleveland Browns playing the Denver Broncos, who have the 4th best defense overall and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Ricky Seals-Jones has only averaged 5.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0 fantasy points last week, only averaging 2 targets per game on the season, only on the field for 31% of the snaps, projected at 4.9 fantasy points here in Week 9. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game. They have the Cleveland Browns favored by 2.5. This is a road game. Ricky Seals-Jones looks to have fallen out of this offense, so I'm going to sit Ricky Seals-Jones here versus the Denver Broncos. And another tight end I'm going to sit is Mike Gesicki from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 4th least fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Mike Gesicki is averaging 4.3 fantasy points per game on the season, only getting 3.6 pass targets per game. He's projected at 6.8 fantasy points here in Week 9. This is a low-scoring game, 41.5 point game total. Miami should be trailing by 4.5. This is a home game for Mike Gesicki, and if you're really struggling at the tight end position, you could think about starting him. But outside that, I'd look for better options. So I'm going to sit Mike Gesicki here versus the New York Jets.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite
Player for this NFL slate.
I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.
Do you want more fantasy football picks? Check out the video linked right in the middle of the screen. If you got any value from this video, please tap that subscribe button before you get out of here and ring that bell notification so you won't miss our daily fantasy football uploads. We're putting out new videos every day, so I don't want you guys to miss any of our free content.